Hello, I'm Elisa Hawley,
And I'm Chris Kozlowski.
and we're gonna talk today about the ABCs of historical research projects.
So, where do I begin? I have always struggled a little bit with, I want to write a paper, but what's my angle? What am I arguing? And it could even be more broad than that, like the topic. So, really just try to nail down the general theme of what you want to talk about. It could be, the time period, like the 1800s. It could be an area, a region. It could be anything really, and then you just get more and more specific. So I knew, for example, that I wanted to write a paper about visual media, visual primary sources, and I'm interested in the Americas during like the Age of Sail. So I gave myself a time period, 1500 to 1800, and I pulled examples from across that time range, and that was the goal of that paper. How, historians can use more primary sources to tie things together. If you're ever not sure, start big, and then you can, from there take a magnifying glass and get a better idea of what you want to talk about.
So you're assigned a research paper and you can choose your own topic, but you need to narrow your topic down. So choosing a topic like American cinema is a good start, but where? Because American cinema begins in the 1890s and can go all the way up to today. So it's a good idea to focus on one aspect of American cinema. So what if you choose American cinema during the Cold War? This is good too, but it's also too broad because during the Cold War takes place from 1947 all the way to 1991. And during that time, hundreds and thousands of films were made. So what about if you choose Ronald Reagan's influence on American cinema during his presidency? So Ronald Reagan was elected January 20th, 1981, all the way to January 20th, 1989. And movies like Red Dawn and Rocky IV were both made during his presidency. Red Dawn's focuses on what if Cuba and the Soviets joined forces and they attacked the U.S. head on. And this was a worry of the people in the United States at that time. That's one example of how to look at a film during that period and also narrow your topic. So make sure you narrow your topic when picking a research paper to do on.
And now, something that's also important for any research paper really is the scholarship that has come before you, and what the experts in your field have been writing about and how it's changed. So, in terms of history specifically, it's historiography, how history is written, because, the history books that are coming out today and the history papers probably look quite a bit different from the history books even 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Since, you want to be familiar with what scholars, what historians are arguing. So if I wanted to talk about visual media in the Americas, I tried to read an array of different books and different histories about the Americas during 1500 and 1800, and I looked for, okay, how are they using visual sources? Has that changed? Is it more likely that experts are going to write using visual primary sources now, or is it more likely before? You want to be familiar with what you're writing about so that when you make your argument in your paper, you aren't, restating what someone else has already argued, or you can better support their stance, or you can say, I like what this person said and I like what person B said, but maybe there's something in the middle too that needs to be talked about. Becoming familiar with the scholarship in your discipline or your area of interest is going to better support you when it comes to, saying what you want to say and placing your argument in between the other arguments already out there. On historiography here, we're talking about historiography specifically, but really most disciplines in the humanities and further have gone through evolutions and changes in how they're taught or spoken about or argued or reasoned or theorized. The verb is yours to choose. But you might not want to write a straight historical paper. You might want to do more of a cultural history, an ethnohistory, a feminist working, a social focus, postmodern, social, quantitative. There are so many ways to write about history, and, kind of choosing one of these lenses to interpret the past can be a benefit because maybe you offer a new perspective, or you can fit, maybe you really like a historian's analysis of the Cold War, but you're like, I wonder how their argument would look under a feminist lens or a gendered lens, for example. So these are just some ideas to get you thinking about the way you want to argue, or, that there's more to consider in terms of historiography or the scholarship that's out there.
Historiography also lets the reader know about the research that other historians have already done on the subject. Your paper is about what you plan to add to the research from new discovery. So you present the information that's already been presented, that's out there, and then you show them what you plan to do next with your new research to add to the existing research on the topic that you've chosen.
So on the next slide here, I just took a screenshot of a paper that I wrote during my master's degree. It's the first paragraph. I was talking about women in modern Mexico from the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries. But the reason I pulled this is just to show you that, in my intro paragraph, I sort of, mention the topic of the paper and what exactly I'm going to be talking about. And I also, in the middle of it, mention the historiography. So I say, the recent historiography of modern Mexico has found ways to comb the available archival material for evidence of women's lived experiences, using various sources from court testimonies to letters to union documents to I go on to sort of say how scholars are writing about Mexican women of various classes, and how, they were affected by the modernization of Mexico. So I don't mention any scholars specifically, but I say this is the trend that the literature has taken, and this is the evidence that they're using. And, I just introduce it there because a lot of that was my evidence in the paper. But I stated early on, this is what's been going on, and this is how they're sort of changing how they write about women in modern Mexico. Sort of similar to the topic of historiography that we've been talking about is the annotated bibliography. I personally had to submit an annotated bibliography before I even began to think about so much as my argument, really. And it's really useful. So an annotated bibliography is sort of like a works cited, but it's before you jump in. And it tells the reader, well, in this case it was my professor, right? These are the sources I'm using, this is why I'm considering them, this is why I think it's important and relevant that I am using it in my paper. And they're good for both primary and secondary sources. So I'll read the list here. So an annotated bibliography should include the discipline of the author, why the source is useful and why you chose it and why it's better than other pieces, the evidence that the source uses, and their framework or methodology. So I have an example here from Purdue OWL. So this one doesn't say particularly the discipline of Davidson. However, you might say historian Davidson's or ethnologist Davidson's. You should make a mention of that because that can also inform the style in which the book was written. Basically, you want to include any and all key points in sort of a concise manner. That's about 5 to 6 sentences long, and that will help you also kind of plan out your paper. I have these sources, and this is why I'm using them, and it can help you sort of organize thematically. Again, the annotated bibliography is sort of like you're taking what you've learned from looking at the historiography or the scholarship of your topic, and you're kind of assembling it into a game plan for your paper. You're saying, I like this source, this is why it'll be a good support for my argument, or it'll be a good counter argument that I'll subvert. And And, sometimes I've had this happen where I really liked a source, but I looked at it in my annotated bibliography and I went, I really wanted to use this, but actually it doesn't really fit in my paper and it doesn't work with my other sources, and that might not help me build the strongest argument I can. So don't be too intimidated by the annotated bibliography. It's just to help you plan a cohesive paper and show your professor, your advisor, and yourself why you're using the sources that you're using to help you come up with a really good argument that is a good intervention on what's already out there, one that can stand up on its own two legs. So we've talked a lot about sources, but now we'll actually get into the nitty-gritty.
So as you can see, there's a list of primary sources on this page. And a primary source doesn't always have to be like a written letter or, George Washington's journal or Thomas Jefferson's journal or anybody's journal. Although these are great examples of primary sources, a primary source could be a government document or George Washington's dentures. For example, if you're doing a research paper on colonial American dental health, George Washington's dentures is a good example of dental health during that time for some people living back then. Another example could be a menu that was used at a Japanese restaurant in 1931 in Los Angeles. By the menu, you can see what ingredients have been used and what types of Japanese food have been served, as well as what type of Japanese food was not on the menu. Sushi may not have been on the menu. So you can see what was missing as well as what was going on during that period at that particular restaurant, or at least in Los Angeles in 1931 at that particular restaurant.
And also for primary sources, we kind of want to remind you to think outside the box. Because most sources have something that they're saying on the surface level, but sometimes if you reanalyze it and look at it from a different way and read between the lines, it might reveal something else that's not so explicit. So a book I read during my master's, which I just absolutely obsessed with, called Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence in the Archive, is all about this. And it talks about, so rarely do we know about the daily lives of women of color who were maybe enslaved or were free. We don't know. There was not much written about them, and what is very skewed. And here, in the example I've included on this slide, is a runaway slave advert. So you know that Jane ran away. She has marks on her body from the violence kind of enacted on her. And we don't know, anything else about her except for her body and the violence. But instead of just, talking about John Wright, the person that put in the ad, or the fact that she ran away, Marisa Fuentes actually uses this advert and the fact that it was from Bridgetown. She also takes maps from Bridgetown and kind of reconstructs what Habit might have looked like for a runaway woman in this time period when, they know the marks on her body. And that's all that was documented aside from her name. So just very interesting ways that you can stitch together primary sources. So if you want to do something new and exciting, feel free and go for it. And you'll probably find other sources or even secondary sources that kind of support you in that. Because that's a big trend right now, is how can we reconsider people that we haven't considered before? So yeah, also a great book. I highly recommend it. But yeah, if you want to maybe talk about an empire or something, you can look at these primary sources and say, what else is it kind of saying?
So as you can see, we have a list of secondary sources, or some examples. Secondary source is a source that is usually written after the event that happened and by someone who was not there. For example, a book written today about the Civil War is a secondary source. A source that was considered to be a secondary source could become a primary source. For example, if a person is doing a report on Pluto, a science book published in the 1960s would state that Pluto is one of the 9 planets in our solar system. This book is a primary source, for example, because the example will show from today's standard that there is a change in the way Pluto is being classified now as a dwarf planet, and is no longer being classified as part of the original 9 planets in our solar system today, because now there's only 8 planets in our solar system. Opinion pieces. Sometimes opinion pieces can become primary sources. Most of the time they're secondary sources. But for example, if you're exploring the 1980s and one topic is the theme of buying made in America goods, an opinion piece written in 1981 about buying made in American goods is a reflection of that time period. That would make the opinion article a primary source. But if an opinion article is written today about the current political climate, this is a secondary source because the writer of the article does not work directly for the White House and is giving their own interpretation of the information from the primary sources, which are the people working in the White House. Scholarly sources versus popular sources. Scholarly sources, they are written by qualified researchers and have a thorough publication process, which usually involves being peer-reviewed and has an extensive list of references at the end of the text. Examples: books in academic journals, articles written by scholars and experts. Popular sources are written for a general audience and are not peer-reviewed. This source usually does not contain references. Example: some magazines and books, websites and blogs, like Rolling Stones magazine, would be a popular source. Identifying a scholarly source versus popular source. Has the source been peer-reviewed? Is there a list of references or a works cited page? Does the author have credentials? Like, are they a history professor or are they a scientist in their field? Who's the audience the source was written for? Was it written for doctors or other historians? Or was it written for your grandma who goes to bingo on Wednesdays? Optionally, was it published by a university publishing house? If you can answer yes to all these questions, your source is a scholarly source, excluding your grandma part. The type of source used will depend on the topic. If you are doing research on medical treatment, then it would be best to use scholarly sources. If you're doing research on current events such as how social media portrays political events, then popular sources can be used. Double check. We all make mistakes, and that includes historians. In the year 2000, historian Theodore C. Bester wrote an article titled "How Sushi Went Global." In the article, he stated that in 1972, the New York Times covered the opening of a sushi bar in the elite sanctum of New York's Harvard Club. Because of his source, another historian wrote a book titled "Modern Japanese Cuisine, Food Power, and National Identity" in 2006 and cited Bester. You could see she puts the birth of the sushi as a sign of class and educational standing was signified by the opening of a sushi bar in the elite sanctum of New York's Harvard Club in 1972. And you can see there's a citation, Theodore C. Bester, How Sushi Went Global. The problem is, this was actually written in November 2nd, 1981 by Jack Rosenthal in the New York Times. The editorial notebooks, Sushi at the Harvard Club. So even though the articles were peer-reviewed, there was still a mistake. Things like this happen. So double check their sources. Go and look at their primary sources. You may find something else interesting that was left out of their paper that you can use for your own. It might further help your research. Here are some good places to find sources on the internet. ProQuest, JSTOR, and HathiTrust are always great places. If you're in California, or if you're even not, California Digital Newspaper Collection has a large collection of newspapers that are primary sources that might help your research. The New York Times and the Los Angeles Times are both well-known primary sources, as well as that have some secondary sources. Local newspapers, like I'm in Los Angeles, so the Rafu Shimpu, or down the street, Seal Beach newspaper. Government websites like the White House.gov, Library of Congress, or Office of Historians. Internet Archives is a great place because it has books, movies, television shows, commercials, and even some websites that have been archived. I'm sure you heard this before and you're going to hear it again. Do not cite Wikipedia. But Wikipedia is a great place to go and look and see what those sources they found. There may be some great primary sources in there you can use yourself, but use those primary sources or secondary sources from that page. Do not cite Wikipedia, because anybody can go on Wikipedia and change it. So this is how to sort when paraphrasing. If you always have to cite, whether you're using quotes or if you're paraphrasing, you got to cite if you got the information from somewhere else. So no matter how many sources you cite in a sentence, the citation comes at the end of the sentence, and you can cite multiple sources in that citation. So let's take a look at these examples. Example 1 is wrong because the citations are in the middle of the sentence. Example 2 is wrong because there is a citation in the middle of the sentence and it should only be at the end of the sentence. Example 3 is wrong because there are 2 citations at the end of the sentence. There should only be number 1. You can have multiple sources under 1 citation. You don't have to have 2 numbers. So example 4 is correct. The citation comes at the end. There's multiple sources. And you'll see in a future slide how to make a multiple source citation. We have some more examples. This time we're citing with quotations. Example 1 is wrong because there are 2 citations inside of the sentence. All the citations should be cited at the end of the sentence. Example 2 is wrong because the citation is inside the quotations. Example 4 is wrong because one of the quotations is inside the sentence. So that makes example 3 the correct answer because the citation is at the end of the sentence outside of the quotations. And you can see here at the bottom an example of what a footnote would look like at the end of that page. So here are some examples of footnotes. The first one is a multiple source footnote. You can see the number 24. That 24 would have been the number that was the citation inside the paper. And this first source is written by Eleanor C. Nordock and Y. Scott Matsumoto, Japanese in Hawaii, Historical and Demographic Perspective, the Hawaiian Journal of History, Volume 11, 1977, and this was from page 166. Now, currently, they want the web page where you got it, if you got it from a internet source, and then right next to it is another site source, Gail Y. Okawa, Remembering Our Grandfathers' Exile, U.S. Imprisonment of Hawaii Japanese in World War II, Honolulu University of Hawaii Press, 2020, and page 1 and 2 are cited. Then here we have a footnote just from a single source, Theodore C. Bester, How Sushi Went Global, Foreign Policy, number 121, 2000, pages 60 through 62. And right under it, I reference Bester again. This time it's citation 27, How Sushi Went Global, 56. Bester wrote multiple things, so sometimes it's best to use the, in this case, journal. Instead of, he also wrote a book and a couple other journal articles. So it's best to let the reader know what source, what Bester source, in this case, I was using. Block quotations, which are also called extracts. A prose quotation of 5 or more lines or more than 100 words should be blocked. CMOS recommends blocking 2 or more lines of poetry. A block quotation does not get enclosed in quotation marks. A block quotation must always begin a new line. Block quotations should be indented with the word processor's indentation tool, and block quotations should not be double spaced. You can see on this next page, here's an example of a block quotation. Library of Congress Cooking in 1950, the paper reported that everyone was intrigued with rice rolls, and there is the block quotation with the citation at the end, no quotation marks. Here's an example of what citations look like in Chicago style at the bottom of the page. So I want to take this moment and teach you a little bit about a great research tool that was a big help to me. It's called Zotero, and it helps you organize your primary and secondary sources for your research papers. As you can see from their example, there's different chapters. They have different folders you can make. This is a movie. You can tell by the symbol. This here is a book. These are probably journal articles. So I'll show you mine. So we have sushi was on my master's thesis on sushi in the U.S. Let's pick 1950 and attention golfers. And you can see it's a newspaper article. The title of the advertisement, who published it, where it was published, and what year. Also, I put a little note here, and it tells me what shop and what page of the newspaper it was on. So let's open up Microsoft Word for a minute, because there is a plugin for Zotero on Microsoft Word. As you can see it right here. And let's say I want to quote 1.21 gigawatts from Back to the Future. Well, you can go to Amazon if you like. And first thing first, let's create a folder for this. We'll call it test. Okay. right here. Click this logo, save as Zotero. So I'm gonna save it as Zotero. It's a Blu-ray, it's a video recording then. And I want to get rid of that part. And I could even put, since I'm only quoting the first movie, we can just put Back to the Future. This particular version was released on October 20th. But let's say you saw it on TV broadcast, you could change to the date when it was airing on TV. But for now, we're going to keep it as a video broadcast. It's the studio that put it out. The year it was put out, how long, and now let's cite it within the works cited, or within the paper in the for the citation. We're going to put Back to the Future. We're going to hit OK. And here we go. Back to the Future, Universal Picture Homes Entertainment 2020. Now, if you want, you can change the date to when the film was first released. I don't remember the exact date, but I know it was, I want to say 1985. And then what you do is refresh. There you go. 1985. Let's say you want to do a quote about sushi from an article in the LA Times. So let's now this is, it was in a newspaper, but this is showing a web page with that symbol. But it is a newspaper article. So you could change the newspaper article if you want. I'm going to leave it as a web page. And I also like to make sure that my dates are the same, whether it's just the year or if it is month and date. I want it all to be uniformed. So you can go in here and change this. I believe that was May 3rd, 2023. Now, as you can see, it's missing the author, right? Well, thankfully, we are right here, and the author's name is Daniel Miller. So we put last, Miller, and then we put Daniel. Let's see what else we got. Let's make it a newspaper article, because it did run in the LA Times, and it was published in Los Angeles. So we can put Los Angeles. We have the date. And if you could find the actual newspaper, you could find out what page this was on. You want to keep the URL these days because they want to know if you got it from a web page. And let's cite that in the paper. So we close that. There we go. Add a citation. And let's just say this was on page 5 for purposes of this example. Okay, right there. Business. The section was business, page 5. Now, let's say you're all done. All right. And you need to get a works cited. Normally, works cited is on its own page. Okay. And it would be like this. Zotero, add bibliography, and it's going to generate a works cited for you. And we just would want to make sure that it was double spaced, and these were all correct with the correct indentions. And that is Zotero. I'd like to show you something else in Zotero that's helpful. If you're like me, you may forget where you put a source, but you remember a title or you remember a note you put in. So what you do is you go up to My Library, you go into search right here, and I'm going to search for a book. And there it is. It's just that easy.
So I'm sure there might be a lot of questions, comments, or concerns about this little talk here, but we've compiled a Google Doc with frequently asked questions that you can consider. If this video is on YouTube, we'll have a link to like a Google Doc, or if it's elsewhere, there should be a PDF that can come along with it if you have any further questions. But hopefully we've covered everything and it gets you excited about, the possibilities and exciting things that you might run into when you're writing a research paper. And that is the end of our talk. I'll end on the works cited page here. But we were so happy to put this together. Hopefully, it gets you excited about the possibilities within research. It can be a little daunting for sure, but there are so many resources out there from your professors, but also your peers and online, and it's all very exciting. And even if you're not in history, good writing and good arguments kind of follow the same principles. Do your reading, make sure you're informed, pick good sources, and all of that will take you a very long way. So thank you.